Maria Regina Brioschi is a postdoc researcher in the philosophy department of the University of Milan and a member of the executive committee of the Italian Association for Pragmatist Studies. She is currently working on Peirce's unpublished manuscripts of logic and metaphysics. Besides articles and chapters, her publications include the new Italian translation of Whitehead's Process and Reality and a monograph entitled Creativity Between Experience and Cosmos, C.S. Peirce and A.N. Whitehead on Novelty. And her talk today is on Reason in Action, the place of Dewey in Whitehead's Harvard lectures.
Yeah. Okay. So good morning, everybody, or whatever, depending on where you are. And special thanks to the organizers of this beautiful conference, and especially to Joe for his patience and attention to details. It's quite rare, at least to me, to discuss Whitehead's philosophy, so I'm very happy to be here with you today. My paper, Reason in Action, the place of Dewey in Whitehead's Harvard lectures, has two distinct but connected aims. The first one is to clarify to what extent Dewey is taken into account in Whitehead lectures. And the second one is to understand better what are the affinities and divergences between Dewey and Whitehead, with special reference to the concept of reason and propositions. To reach these goals, the paper is divided into three parts. The first one summarizes how the relationship between Whitehead and Dewey has usually been described by scholars. The second part displays and comments on the passages where Whitehead explicitly discusses Dewey thesis in the Harvard lectures. And the third part ponders over their conception of reason and the proposition in order to reassess more broadly Whitehead's proximity and difference with pragmatism. So the first part, Whitehead and Dewey. First of all, similarities and differences. So overall, I must say that the connections between Whitehead and pragmatism, and particularly between Whitehead and Dewey, do not constitute an unexplored field of investigation, as you can see from these not exhaustive references. Overall speaking, there are some tendencies that are common to pragmatism as well as Whitehead or Santayana, but I must skip this part because it's too general, actually. So moving to, in particular, Whitehead and Dewey, there are some specific common tenets that can be pointed out. And I am relying especially on Meyer's works here. So to sum them up, on the side of similarities, we can say that they have similar starting points, methods, and view, nature and purpose of metaphysics. So this point, I can say that in a nutshell, for both authors, metaphysics starts from experience and aims to come back to it with a renewed observation, as Whitehead says in Process and Reality, rendered acute by rational interpretation. Remember the airplane flight. And or elsewhere, Whitehead says that the elucidation of immediate experience is the sole justification for any thought, and the starting point for thought is the analytic observation of components of this experience. Okay, so on the other hand, Dewey sees philosophy as the ground map for criticism, as we know that. And we know that also Whitehead thinks that philosophy has this very important critical role. And according to Dewey, this ground map for criticism ends up in a new perspective, which leads to a new survey of possibilities. So this was the first similarities. Then we can say that they share an anti-dogmatic and anti-foundationalist character of metaphysics, not in Rorty's sense, but more close to, let's say, Peirce's fallibilism. So think about, for instance, with regard to Whitehead, to his famous fallacy of the perfect dictionary, or where he says that in Process and Reality, that philosopher can never hope finally to formulate this, sorry, see your face here, okay, this metaphysical first principles. weakness of insight and deficiencies of language stand in the way inexorably. Okay, and table. Okay, and then they both think that. Sorry. Okay.
Maria, I think something's rubbing up against the microphone, maybe pieces of paper or something. It's giving quite a bit of feedback. So just to let you know.
Okay, thank you. And then the third point they share is the view of the body as the focal region of experience, and that allow them to expand an anti-dualistic perspective. So they both maintain this continuity in between mind and body and word. Okay, so about differences then, Whitehead, after all, is systematic, whereas Dewey is anti-systematic. Also, Whitehead offers a mathematical formal interpretation to the first principles, whereas Dewey offers a genetic functional method. And related to this last point, Whitehead professes to be a rationalist, whereas Dewey saw himself as a radical empiricist. Okay, so yeah, I can skip that. Okay, so those differences and similarities are the results of some comparisons made by Dewey and Whitehead scholars. So those similarities and differences may be put into question, but this is not my aim here. The reason why I have introduced them is to underline that there are valuable points of intersection between the two philosophers, but they are mainly the outcomes of posterior studies upon Dewey and Whitehead's thought. So if we want to consider only what Dewey and Whitehead explicitly said about each other, the material is quite limited and scattered. In this regard, there are lectures, I think, that add something that we did not know before. So what did Dewey said about Whitehead and vice versa? Dewey wrote two essays about Whitehead's philosophy. The first one is was delivered in 1936 and then published in 1937, and another one in 1941. And as Dewey himself says to Sidney Hook in 1941, the latter essay was essentially built on the previous one, although enriched with quotes, etc. Then Dewey wrote also two interesting reviews. One is the review of Science and the Modern World that was published in 1926. And another one is the review of Adventures of Ideas. So on the whole, from these essays and reviews emerges how Dewey praises Whitehead's empiricism and naturalism, but criticizes his rationalism and the adoption of the mathematical formal method instead of a genetic functional one. So in Dewey's own words, I will start from the fourth line. As currents of philosophy are running at present, it is altogether likely that Whitehead's philosophy, immediate influence will be mainly upon the side of what I called the mathematical model. Its enduring influence in behalf of the integrated naturalism to which Whitehead is devoted seems to me to demand the other interpretation. There is without doubt a certain irony in giving to Mr. Whitehead's thought a mathematical interpretation, for that implies, after all, the primacy of the static over the process. And then the last sentence is, the plea then for the alternative direction of development of his thought is in essence a plea for recognizing the infinite fertility of actual occasions in their full actuality. And then Dewey summarizes in another essay that the modern Heraclitean is Alfred North Whitehead, but he is Heraclitus with a change. The doctrine of the latter, while it adds that all things flow like a river, and that change is so continuous that a man cannot step into the same river even once, since it changes as it steps, nevertheless also add that there is a fixed order which controls the ebb and flow of the universal tide. So if we move to Whitehead and what he said on Dewey, everybody knows, I think, that famous passage, the famous footnotes in the Prophecies and Reality preface, where Whitehead expressed his high esteem and depth toward pragmatism. although he does not fully identify with it due to the charge of anti-intellectualism. I think that I can skip the quote. Then in 1939, Whitehead wrote a very concise essay on Jewish philosophy entitled Jewish Philosophy, John Dewey and His Influence, where he underlies how at that time they all were living in the midst of the period subject to Jewish influence. In those pages, Whitehead compares Dewey to ancient Stoics, for instance, or Aquinas, or Francis Bacon, Descartes, Locke, and others, insofar as Whitehead thinks that those men are all men who have made philosophic thought relevant to the need of their own day. The fame of these men is not primarily based on special doctrines, which are the subsequent delight of scholars. As the result of their activities, the social systems of their times received an impulse of enlightenment, enabling them more fully to achieve such high purposes as were then possible. Okay, nonetheless, Whitehead also criticizes Dewey, criticizes that Dewey has never been appalled by the novelty of an idea. And this is probably due, according to Whitehead, to the self-defensive attitude that is usually associated with well-established schools of thought. So Whitehead states, on the contrary, that nothing is more curious than the okay, you got the word, dogmatism with which mankind at each period of its history cherishes the delusion of the finality of its existing modes of knowledge. Skeptics and believers are all alike. At this moment, scientists and skeptics are the leading dogmatists. Advancing detail is admitted, fundamental novelty is barred. This dogmatic common sense is the death of philosophic adventure. The universe is vast. And then in a passage of the dialogues, Whitehead comes back to this point, and in the following page, again refers to Dewey and says, "You may have wondered at my coolness, not to John Dewey personally, whom I respect as a man and certain aspects of whose work I admire, but to his thought. The reason is that the emphasis of his thought is on security, but the vitality of a man's mind is an adventure." So apart from this consideration, Dewey is absent in Whitehead's writings, whereas in Dewey's later works, Whitehead is quoted sometimes, but only rarely. So given this overview, I move to the core of my paper. What does Whitehead say about Dewey in the other lectures? And I will omit some short passages. There are 7 points. The first one is in the other lecture of the fall semester, 1925, where Whitehead puts, as you can see, Dewey among the bibliographic references for the class, although we don't know what is exactly philosophy and science. Then the next year, always in the other lecture in the full semesters, after introducing the Greeks and the 17th century philosophy, especially Descartes and Locke, Whitehead draws, according to the notes, a parallel between Locke's and Dewey's experience and nature. In this regard, we can detect here 3 relevant points that Whitehead makes. The first one is that Whitehead and Dewey have a similar understanding of nature. The second one, the second one is that they adopt different methods, pragmatism against rationalism. And third, that every proposition implies a word. So propositions, according to Whitehead, can be viewed as formula for action, but they are actually not reducible to this definition. And okay. Then the third part where Dewey appears is this one. And here Whitehead says, for Dewey, goal is use. For Whitehead, explanation. Consideration of use is one test, as is whether you have things straight. Explanation is basis of successful action. But everything is something in itself and for its own sake. And the object of science and philosophy is attempt to get explanation. First people who studied philosophy had no idea it was any use, wanted it for explanation. And then the last quote, yeah. Motive power to get something new is an interesting explanation. Love of explanation is ultimate motive for fundamental advances in civilization. Then, in October, still in October 1926, Whitehead come back to, Whitehead starts from self-evidence and then says that, oh, sorry, I missed the passage, I guess. Yeah, okay, this was the passage that I was looking for. Okay, so talking about self-evidence, Whitehead says that reaction to it now against all rationalism, pragmatism, but don't take the extreme form of pragmatism. Thinks Dewey working backwards from extreme form, looking backwards to modify the rationalism. Real self better than superficial denial. Perhaps Dewey could accept the 7 standards as touchstones of pragmatic criticism. I can go into the detail of the 7 criteria, but you can read it in the Harvard lectures. Then, and to conclude, the passage is quoted, Whitehead also says that the gap between the two schools, pragmatism, is not very wide. Rationalism admits pragmatism as corrected a false rationalistic method. And then also Aristotle revolved against the rationalism of Plato, Dewey against that of Descartes. Whitehead's type of rationalism takes a middle course, which corrects the false method of Descartes and which is easily reconciled with the pragmatic point of view. Okay, then there are other points that are interesting because, for instance, this is the seminary metaphysics where Whitehead comments on Dewey experience and nature extensively. And there are some parts that are interesting because the note says that Whitehead is trying to describe same thing as Dewey, or again, the notes emphasizes a similarity. John Dewey and Whitehead, for instance, emphasize activity. So to conclude, to conclude, from the analysis of these passages, 3 conclusions may be drawn, and for reason of time, I briefly list them from the most general to the more specific one. So first one, Whitehead has... What?
Yeah, you got about 3 minutes.
Okay, yeah, it's perfect. So first, Whitehead has not only a great esteem for Dewey, but thought that on many points they have convergent theses and approaches, such as their understanding of nature and reason as not detached from experience, as well as their emphasis on experience and its connection to the methods of metaphysics. But second point, in the case of Whitehead, nonetheless, his empiricism does not imply a dismissal of reason, or better yet, the submission of reason to activity or action. So for Whitehead, the aim of reason is explanation, and this cannot be coincident with action or activity. Although it's also true that every explanation has some practical consequences on existence. So for Whitehead, the urge for which reason is triggered is that of explaining things, not of acting for some purposes. And this, I think, anticipates the famous distinction that Whitehead made in the function of reasons, that between the speculative reason and practical reason. But these passages, I think that these passages of Dewey may suggest that Whitehead made this distinction having in mind specifically Dewey and the success of that time of pragmatism. Third point, both Dewey and Whitehead agree that the function of proposition does not consist in their being true or false. This approach is misleading, according to both, because it does not take into account the elliptical character of proposition, the fact that they always must be referred to a background. It's impossible to judge if a proposition is true or false without considering the specific universe to which it refers. However, for Whitehead, it is crucial to acknowledge that propositions are not only modes of action, as Dewey maintains. As Whitehead specifies, for instance, in Process and Reality, a proposition is a new kind of entity. A proposition is a lure for feeling, but is also a new kind of entity. It is, oh, I'm sorry. yeah, it is a hybrid between pure potentialities and actualities. And just to conclude, last sentence, Whitehead here emphasizes that the hypothetical status of proposition. So propositions are lure for feelings. They allow one to envisage new possibilities and potentialities. They activate new feelings, and by so doing can lead in a second moment to action. Before action, therefore, propositions have already transformed and enlarged our world with their hypothetical mode of being. And last but not least, it's important also to remember that both Whitehead and Dewey have the same criticism toward the Aristotelian understanding of proposition in terms of subjects, predicates. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Brioschi. I'll give her a very warm hand. If you could stop sharing that.
Yeah.
Oh, perfect. So, it's still sharing. And I'm glad to see Joe's hand up because I was curious about the second point you were making about Dewey and whether Whitehead was partly responding to him. As you mentioned, he assigned Dewey to his students in class. He also did that with C.D. Broad, and Joe in his forthcoming book has a chapter on this topic about using C.D. Broad as a foil for the classroom and for his own thinking. And I was wondering whether, and before you answer, maybe I'll let Joe jump in too, but whether or not he's using Dewey in the same way. So it's not so much assigning Dewey in class, just obviously not to explain Dewey, but rather as not a punching bag, that would be a little unfair, but as a foil for thinking through his own philosophy. But Joe, are you going to jump on the similar topic or no?
No, why don't we go for that?
Do that first?
Yeah.
Okay, all right.
Okay, so I think that these classes are very interesting because there are so many cases of great philosophers that when wrote are very difficult to read and to understand, whereas in classes you can see really where they take their ideas. And I think that this is a good case. That Whitehead Harvard lecture is a good case for those kind of consideration, because just one moment, sorry, I'm very sorry, but my kids and the babysitter was closed outside the door. And so, no, I was just thinking that in this case, it seems to me that Whitehead, that from the Harvard lecture, we see how Whitehead has in mind Dewey and how Dewey's work allow Whitehead to develop his own thought. And as it often happens, many times philosophers use not to quote the people from where they took their own ideas, right? And so, yes, I think that I agree with your consideration.
Perfect. All right, Joe, what are you thinking?
Yeah, well, first, I just wanted to make you aware that actually we do have a letter from Dewey that he wrote to Whitehead in 1926, where he briefly discusses a divergence in their philosophies. And we have it up for free online. It's viewable. I'm just pasting the link in the chat, and I won't go into it anymore now because it would take too long. We would not have much time to discuss. But another thing I wanted to bring up was just something to add. You talked a lot about propositions in Dewey and Whitehead, and one of my favorite quotations from Whitehead about propositions actually comes from his Harvard lectures of 1933, which we've not even begun to edit. Sometimes I get to cheat this way since I have access to all this stuff. But here's the quote that I'll put in the chat. Propositions should not be handed over to logicians to study. Logicians are dry, hard people. Propositions fall properly within the province of poets, lovers, and lunatics. I just wanted to throw this out there as an intriguing line of Whitehead's on propositions, but also I thought I may as well ask you if you see this statement as having any bearing on what you just discussed.
Yes, so thank you very much. I read the letter you mentioned, and that was in line of with the points that I made in my speech. So thanks. I knew that, but also thank you for this very nice quote. Of course, I did not know that, and it's really funny also because I mean, Whitehead is a logician after all, you know, and so I really appreciate it. Thank you so much. And well, sorry, you also had something. I didn't mean to ignore that. Yeah, I think that this reference that you put, so with this emphasis on poets, lovers, and lunatics, is very interesting because it underlines again those sphere of the practice from where that we need to consider if we really want to understand proposition. So then Whitehead uses different languages. Okay, so in Process and Reality is very formal in a way, it's very odd also, and in other places like the quotes that you put in the chat, he is very nice, but I think that the meaning is exactly the same. So where he talks in Process and Reality about the fact that propositions are lures for feelings, he's exactly referring to that kind of sphere.
Yes, I agree. Thank you.
I think we could squeeze in one more question if anyone has a nice tight question to pose. If not, we can go on to Enrico. William, please feel free to join us.
Unmuting. So just to put a point on this, isn't it then the case that propositions are not merely verbal, a gesture, a holding together of an anticipation in the theater of actuality is a proposition?
Yeah, I agree with that also because
Thank you.
also for pragmatists, not also Dewey, but especially I'm thinking of Peirce. This there is really a continuity in between gesture and proposition, and if we detach proposition from gesture, we ends up in understanding nothing.
Yeah.
So thanks, I agree.
That was super fast. Well done, William. Thank you. that was perfect. All right. Well, I think we'll go ahead and thank Professor Brioschi. Thank you so much for a wonderful talk. Let's give her another round of applause. Thank you very much.